Now we come to the main thing you're here for. So long ago, Marirose received her bachelor's degree in biology with an emphasis in botanical sciences from the University of Montana. She then went on to work as a botanist at the MPG ranch, just below where she and her family lived off the grid in the Sapphire Range. After that, or maybe during that, she went on to graduate school remotely, earning a master's degree in entomology from the University of Florida. And Marirose is currently the habitat coordinator for the Missoula County Department of Ecology. And so tonight she's going to talk about home landscaping as a restoration practice. So let's welcome Marirose Kuhlman. I'll leave this one here.
Okay, maybe I'll round. Okay. Let's see. Okay, thanks, Peter, for the introduction. Yeah, so as Peter said, I work here at the Missoula Department of Ecology, and my work is focused on pollinator habitat conservation and education, and I provide technical assistance and advice to county residents and land managers. So much of my previous work at the MPG Ranch was focused on wild bee ecology and documenting how bee communities respond to plant community restoration efforts. But today I'll be talking about home landscaping as a restoration practice and why you might want to do that. Are you guys hearing me okay, or is it kind of echoey? It's okay. Okay. All right. And we're gonna, okay. So I'll just start with this outline for the talk. I'm gonna talk about, we're gonna go over what is restoration, and I'm gonna talk about ecosystem services. I'll review pollinators and why you might want to care about them. I'll cover biodiversity loss and insect declines, and then talk about how native plants and native insects need each other. I always have to do a honeybee PSA. And then I'll go over some steps you can take at home, and I'll answer any questions. So I titled this talk Landscaping for Pollinators as a Restoration Practice, but what is restoration? When I talk about restoration in this context, I'm talking about ecological restoration, and that's defined as the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that's been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. And it's distinct from conservation in that it attempts to retroactively repair already damaged ecosystems rather than take preventative measures. And it's hard to know sometimes when restoration is complete. Ecological restoration, it aims to reestablish like a self-organizing ecosystem that's on a trajectory to full recovery, but that may never happen. But ecosystems are made up of many different parts. So plants, animals, and insects, for example, are all present in ecosystems. But processes as well, called ecosystem services, are part of ecosystems too, and they can be damaged and destroyed. Ecosystem services are the direct and indirect benefits provided by the natural world that make life possible for people, and of course, anything, but we're so selfish. You know, it's all for us. So some examples of ecosystem services include oxygen production by plants, decomposition and nutrient cycling, water absorption, and water filtration by soil, that kind of stuff. And pollination is a key ecosystem service. Plants need pollinators to reproduce. Around 80% of the world's flowering plants, including half of our agricultural crops, require an animal pollinator. Most plants and animals wouldn't exist without pollinators. And so healthy terrestrial ecosystems, including healthy landscaping, is really only possible if you have healthy pollinator populations. But first, what are pollinators? We usually think of pollinators as bees. A lot of people, honeybees or bumblebees, like this cute bumblebee, come to mind for a lot of people. But a pollinator is an animal, usually an insect, that moves pollen from the anther of one plant to the stigma of another plant of the same species and allows for reproduction. So basically a pollinator facilitates plant sex so there can be more plants. Like I said, your garden wouldn't happen without pollinator. Elk hunting wouldn't happen without pollinators. Pollinators help make life on Earth possible, and that's one reason you should care about them. But a lot of different insects, not just bees, can be pollinators. So these are all pollinators that I just want to point out that the photos in this slideshow are mostly from me. I'll point out if they're not from me, and the vast majority of them have been taken here in Missoula County. So these are creatures and scenes, flowers and insects that you can see here in Missoula County. So in this picture, we have moths and butterflies, common pollinators, but flies can also be important pollinators. Beetles are great pollinators in some cases. In the middle there is this great golden digger wasp, one of my favorite wasps, also a good pollinator. And then a hummingbird, it's hard to see, can also be a pollinator. Bats can be pollinators. In Montana, we don't have any pollinating bats. So if you're putting up bat houses, they're just eating insects. All our bats are insectivores. In the Southwest, they're super helpful for pollinating cactus species. But as many people have heard, wild bees and other pollinators are in decline, and it's happening around the world. In fact, total insect abundances and not just pollinators are declining. And this is a big problem, right? Because insects are at the base of the food chain, or rather food web. They're usually the first in line after plants to transfer the sun's energy into available forms of energy for wildlife of all kinds. And there are really a lot of reasons for declines. And it's been described as death by 1,000 cuts. So there's a lot of variability across space and time and taxonomic lineages in terms of the insect declines. But overall, rates of declines in insect abundance are measured at about 1% to 2% per year. And so that's hard to notice from year to year. But it means that after 30 years, you've lost a quarter of all insects. So that has huge implications for trophic cycles. And we know that's happening. That's not just projected, that's currently happening. So yeah, huge implications for trophic cycles, energy cycles. When you look at this weather, this graphic, you can see that at the top it's like, well, these are all mostly human caused. Climate change, such as storm intensity, droughts, nitrification, fire, interaction disruption. Those are big climate change kind of policy issues that need to be addressed. On the bottom are some of the things that sometimes individuals can deal with, and that includes urbanization, introduced species, insecticide use, that kind of stuff. So habitat destruction and alteration, it just has an outsized impact on all organisms, including pollinators. Humans convert natural ecosystems to agricultural and urban environments because we need to eat and we need a place to live. Urban and suburban land use types are currently the fastest growing ecosystems globally. And humans at this point have converted 50% of the Earth's terrestrial surface for our use. So that doesn't leave a whole lot of space for other organisms. So there are a few things you can do at home to help pollinators, and we'll talk about that. Another major driver of species loss is agricultural intensification and increased pesticide use. Now, not many animals or plants can live in this environment, but this is a really efficient way to produce a lot of food for a lot of people. But you can guess that there's probably going to be some trade-offs. Another big driver of insect declines is invasive species introductions. This picture is from just outside Ovando along the Blackfoot here. Okay, I'm just kidding. This is from the Southeast US. I pulled this image from the North American Whitetail Association website, who urge you to care about invasive species because it makes the hunting so bad. This is kudzu, by the way. It was introduced from Japan to help with erosion along roadsides in the eastern US, and it does help with erosion. But a photo that might look a little more familiar is something like this, right? We have a smoky landscape. This is in August, a picture of a pretty dense patch of knapweed at a conservation property I worked at. So it's pretty much just knapweed and cheatgrass in this hillside here. And you know, obviously we don't like knapweed. And so a lot of times people think about what they don't like. They don't like knapweed, so they want to spray it, right? But you can't spray your way out of this. This is going to require restoration. If you were to spray this, all that you would have left would be cheatgrass or some other secondary invasion. So you need to think about the plant communities that you do want, because getting rid of the plants you don't want doesn't make things better automatically. And this is where your landscaping plays a role. I took this picture of Peter Lessica's house just to give an example of, so habitat, this is not Peter's house. Habitat destruction and invasive plant species are major drivers of insect declines. In an environment like this, I would say that it's arguably even worse than that knapweed hillside, because this is an ecological dead zone, but not just is it inhospitable to like pretty much everything, including people, really? Does that look like a fun place to hang out? But it requires, it's a huge resource sink. So can you imagine the amount of water, like say this is in Missoula or Las Vegas, the amount of water and fertilizer to keep it green, plus the labor and energy resources just to run the lawnmower to make these perfect stripes. When I was looking up images, I found that some people actually they use these stripes and they'll make an American flag in their yard. And I just thought it was amazing. Like that's like only in America when we do something so incredible. So this is habitat destruction, right? And non-native plant introduction, and this too contributes to insect declines. So I started out talking about pollinators, and now I'm talking about insects. And like, why do we even care about insects? Because it's, you know, a lot of people see insects and they think they're bad. They like get on their plants. Like, look at this goldenrod. It's just covered in aphids and ants, and there's a couple different species of ladybugs. And like, you know, they could sting you or bite you, and they're just disgusting and gross. And like, I can't even, and ooh, right? So, but native plants and native insects have evolved together for millions of years. And these plants, these insects that are eating these plants, the plants produce compounds, right, that make them taste bad, or there's some sort of defense. Maybe they have thorns or some sort of toxin, and they can injure the insects that eat them. But then as insects evolve with plants, they find ways to overcome these compounds. But the point is that that's pretty common in the insect world. Plants and insects really belong together. And 90% of insects globally that eat plants can only eat the plants with which they co-evolved. And so what that means is if I have a native goldenrod, it's home, and it is a resource for a lot of different native insects. But if I were to plant chrysanthemums from Lowe's, I'm just not going to get that insect community. And there is an issue with that, because maybe I don't like insects. I actually really like insects, but maybe you don't like insects. Someone doesn't like insects. But you should consider that animals and birds that rely on insects for food care about insects. And some people around here are birders. Birding is a really popular activity, and it's something you can do right in your backyard. And nesting birds require insects. In particular, they require caterpillars, which, as it turns out, are baby butterflies and moths. And caterpillars transfer more energy to animals than any other plant-eating insect taxon. They're filled with protein, they've been compared to little sausages, and they're just soft, right? So baby birds can eat them. The parent is not afraid to shove bunches of caterpillars down their baby's throat because they're nice and soft and they don't injure them. So a chickadee like this that weighs as much as 4 pennies has to feed its young between about 6 to 9,000 caterpillars in 16 days just to get them to the fledgling stage. So if a chickadee, which you see sometimes in town, if it's nesting in your yard and you have a yard filled with non-native plants, you likely don't have the insect base in order to support the nest that couple is trying to raise, and it will most likely fail. So the long and short of it is that native plants and native insects need each other. And I just want to say that plants without insects on them are nearly useless. They're not providing habitat, they won't support bird life, and they don't support pollinators. They really need one another. It's just something that you like to look at, and there's certainly value in that, but it isn't habitat, and it doesn't support a healthy ecosystem. So this is what I think your goal should be, but you have to choose it for yourself, right? You want a healthy ecosystem for your landscape. Healthy plant communities rely on healthy insect and pollinator communities, and vice versa. And they need a diversity of native plants. So you probably all know that because this is the Native Plant Society and we love native plants. But what does that have to do with restoration or landscaping? Because while this lovely native grassland may be an ideal for some people, it often isn't practical or even desirable in an urban setting, right? That's probably not what you want for your yard. But remember that restoration is a process. And a lot of times land managers and the public, we focus on natural areas as being the recipients of our conservation or restoration efforts. Like conservation, happens out there in grasslands and forests and other open spaces. But there's been quite a bit of research recently in urban areas showing that in many cases, they can harbor pollinator species that are indicative of high quality habitat. And in fact, in some cases, the native bee communities in urban areas are more diverse than the surrounding rural landscapes, especially if those rural landscapes have a lot of intense agriculture in them. So urban areas can actually serve as a refuge for our charismatic microfauna, such as insect pollinators. So this presents an opportunity, right, for small scale and yet attainable restoration that homeowners and community members can undertake right on their own property or their parks or other community spaces. Like you can do this, right? Native plant landscaping can be really beautiful. It is very attainable. Here's 2 examples from Missoula. The one on the left here is Marilyn Marler and David Schmetterling's place, if you're familiar with them. David has a great blog called Montana Wildlife Gardener. He doesn't contribute to it anymore, but it's still just an amazing resource. And just so you know, this landscape, which is so lovely, it did not occur overnight, right? I've known David and Marilyn since 1999, and this was like a yard with a cement path from the back door all the way down their yard and over. This was probably taken in 2010. Over that period of time, they have transformed their yard and it just continues to grow. So it's a process, but things like this don't happen overnight. And then the yard on the right over there is from Native Yards by Giles Teelan's company. He used to attend Native Plant Society stuff. So anyway, native plants, they can be a component of your landscaping. They can be the focal point of your landscaping, like in Marilyn and David's case. But really, every little bit helps. Even just pots of blanket flower on your deck is helpful. So let's get back to pollinators, because even though I talked about insects, pollinators are like a gateway drug for many people who want to landscape in an environmentally conscious way, right? We all want to do like pollinator friendly gardens and like help the pollinators. So we don't have to talk about insect herbivores or like food webs or anything. We can just talk about pollinators and bees, because bees remember, a lot of different insects can be pollinators. However, wild bees are the most important of the pollinators. And not just because they're my favorite, but there's a reason for that. They're just kind of built different. They're equipped, this is a close-up image of the abdomen of a bee. So the body part of the bee. And you can see that she has these feathery branching hairs, right? So bees are equipped with the specialized branching hairs on their body that help them store and carry pollen and nectar as they travel from flower to flower. Now, bees are a type of vegetarian wasp. And all bees have, and they get their pollen, instead of being predatory and hunting other creatures or other insects, they get pollen, and that's where they get their fats and proteins from. So in addition to collecting pollen, they usually visit flowers of the same species in succession. This is a behavior called floral constancy. It increases the chances of pollination. So they're just visiting a species, like maybe they'll go for blanket flower and they'll visit it, blanket flower, blanket flower, blanket flower, blanket flower, blanket flower. It's just an easy way. I think they're probably used to, my understanding is that it's a flower handling type of thing, right? So like when you get a search image in your mind and you're just looking for that thing, you find it the same type of deal with floral constancy. So bees are wholly reliant on pollen and nectar for their nutrition and to provision their offspring. And it's the source of all their protein and fats in the pollen and carbohydrates and some amino acids in the nectar. These are all Missoula County bees. Native bees are super diverse. You can see they come in all different shapes and sizes. Different species may fly at different times of the day or different times of the growing season. These different species have different flower handling techniques. So basically, wild bee diversity is vital to the maintenance of plant diversity. And that means that wild bees are vital in native ecosystems, but they're also essential to the success of any restoration effort. And they're important in agriculture and in your home gardens. So how many bee species do we have, right? So globally, there are 20,000 species of bee. There's approximately 4,000 species of bee in North America. It's thought that there are over 600 up to 1,000 in the state of Montana, and over 230 species of bees have been documented just in Missoula County. And they have really diverse life histories. That means how they choose to nest or their flower preferences. They have different social structures. And let's see, go on here. So here's all the things that they have: different nest preferences, 70% nest in the ground. They have different flower preferences. Some are specialists and some are generalists. And I'll just skim over that. And then they have different social structures. But the important thing to remember is that 90% of them are solitary, right? And honeybees, which are not native to North America, are very different from everybody because they're highly social with these perennial colonies. That's actually, you should take that image and remove it from your mind. That is not how our native bees live. They're very different from native bees. So another very important trait of bees is that they're central place foragers. Let me get to that. Oh, dang. There we go. On the bottom, central place foragers. So that means that, which are kind of like birds, right? So they have a nest, a female has a nest, and she travels back and forth from her nest in order to gather nectar and pollen to provision her offspring, kind of like a bird, kind of like you. You're usually probably shopping at the grocery store closest to your house. You're probably not going to Livingston every day to shop, or even very often, or probably ever, because you too are a central place forager. So what that means is that where you see bees, when you see a bee, you are very close to where it is nesting. It lives within about 400 yards of where you're seeing it. So when people think of bees, like I said, they think of living in hives with a queen or worker and drones, but that situation is unique to honeybees, and this is more common. So 90% of our native bee species, 90% nest alone, which means they provision their offsprings by themselves without help. So like most of them are single moms. These are the nests of leafcutter bees. This was at MPG Ranch near a garden. It's a nesting block, and each bamboo tube here is being used by a single female bee. There's no working together. They just live near each other. This is like a high density housing. So I want to point out that only about 30% of bee species, mostly the leaf cutters and the masons, which are just in the single family, will nest in a bee hotel like this. Bee hotels are fine, but they're really limited in the species they support. There's better ways to create nesting habitat. So 30% of species will nest in stems. Here's some more stem nesters. The bee at the top is actually an Arizona carpenter bee from Arizona. So I'm showing you this because they're nesting in stems. The bottom is an elderberry. And this is why they tell you not to clear out your garden too early, because you could be throwing away baby bees, right? So some bees will use cavities such as hollow stems. The Arizona carpenter bee at the top, this is using a yucca stem, and the larval part, the cells are partitioned with chewed plant material from the yucca stem, so that's a carpenter bee, but at the bottom is a leafcutter bee, and in this case, the mom has cut pieces of leaf and use that to wrap the nectar and pollen provision plus her egg, and she wraps it up in pieces of leaf like a bee Rito, and the babies develop in that. So just want to point out that this is the various larval stages at the top there of bees. See, it's like more like an adult. This is like a ferret adult here almost. And then they're kind of grub-like. Those are baby bees. And they spend most of their lives in this larval stage. You actually, when you see them flying, they're kind of at the end of their life. They're adults, and they're only adults for a few weeks. And so when we focus on floral resources for bees, that's great, but there's just a breed. They also need nesting habitat. That's incredibly important. So overwhelmingly, bees nest in the ground. In fact, 70% of bees nest in the ground, and allowing there to be patches of bare soil is important for ground nesting bees. You may want to keep this in mind when you're mulching. That big gravel or bark mulch is impossible for bees to nest in. They're not going to be able to get through it. They need access to soil. So even if you do mulch, if you could use a finer mulch, or like mulch towards the front of your garden bed and maybe leave some bare stuff at the back. But what I want to point out with this is that ground nesting bees, which are most bees, are not only in contact with flowers, but they're in contact with soil throughout their entire lives. They live in the soil as eggs and larvae. They stay dormant in the soil over winter. And even when they're adults, they dig a nest in soil, and then they crawl in and out of the soil repeatedly to bring provisions and to lay eggs. So ground nesting bees are affected by the soil and what you put in the soil. So that's something to think about when you're doing a soil drench, for example, around your tree, or are spraying any kind of herbicide or pesticide, or even people who like to spray salt and vinegar mixes. Those all affect the soil, and they affect nesting habitat for bees. And the bees are in constant contact with soil. This is just another example of soil nesting. This is in eroding, like a bank of the Bitterroot River. I found actually 4 different species of bees using this bank as nesting substrate. And then this is an image I pulled off the internet. It's an example of a bumblebee nest. It was found in an old rodent burrow, which is a really common place for them. And do you see any honeycomb anywhere in this nest? No, because they are not honeybees, and the only bees that make honey and honeycomb are honeybees. So bumblebees have a much more disorganized nesting situation. They are a social bee. They have a single queen and workers. They don't have drones. Just near the end of this growing season, the queen lays eggs that become males and new queens, and then everybody except the mated new queens die at the end of the year. The mated new queens hibernate and emerge in spring. So, as I emphasized before, most bee species are solitary, and most solitary bee species are seasonal, just like flowers are seasonal. So the pollinators match, they fly at the same time that their flowers are blooming. So an important way to support native bees at home is to plant lots of different flower species, ideally native plant species, to provide appropriate blooms for native species. I'll just illustrate my point here. So this graph is a graph of flowering phenology or flowering timing from 4 years of data at MPG Ranch. Along the bottom is the date. See, it goes April, May, June, July, August, September. And then the numbers along the x-axis, the up and down axis, is the number of plant species flowering at the time. So this illustrates the pattern we see with our local native plants, right? Like here we're in April, we're starting to see buttercups. Some people are seeing yellow bells. There's like a few pasque flowers around, but we know by like May and into June, it's just gonna be like a riot of flowers on the hillsides. And then by July, it'll all be almost over. But it really starts to decline and dry up, right? So in Western Montana, we see our highest diversity in numbers of bees as well during that peak bloom period in May and June, when we see most flower species blooming. And then as the number of flower species starts to decline later in the season, we also see fewer bee species later in the season. And in fact, a lot of our late season blooming plants are asters, right? And a lot of our late season bees are aster specialists. So bees can also have a graph of phenology like flight timing. This is called a flight phenology. So the letters on the bottom, AM, JJ, ASO, on the bottom of each graph is April, May, June, July, August, September. So that's time. And then the numbers of bees that I caught are there on the y-axis. So Andrena, the mining bees, are these early spring bees. We're seeing a lot of them right now. They can tolerate these colder temperatures and the windier conditions. They tend to fly a little lower, and they tolerate conditions that honeybees cannot. They're pretty much gone from the landscape by the middle of June. Leafcutter bees are late season bees. They start to show up around June and July, and they last into the end of the growing season. And then green sweat bees are they're a social bee, so you see them all season long. It's not the same individual that lasts all season. There's just successive generations, right? You see it the whole growing season. So another aspect of native bee diversity is that different species of native bee, remember there's around 600 in Montana, they have different floral preferences or dietary needs, and these differences are species specific. But all bees rely wholly on flowers to meet all their nutritional requirements. So let me show you some different examples of dietary needs of some of our native bees. Some bees are extreme floral specialists, like the death camas mining bee. So this is death camas, which is a lovely grassland plant, I think, fairly common in some places on the hillside, and it's very toxic. Nothing can really eat it or even tolerate eating it, including insects. It's toxic to other insects, but not to the death camas mining bee. And the death camas mining bee can only use death camas pollen. So this plant requires an insect pollinator, but only one insect can pollinate it. So it's a really close one-to-one relationship. It's an extreme specialization. It's a really rare relationship because it's also kind of a risky relationship. But I do like it. A little more common in terms of specialization are bees like this. So here's some scarlet globe mallow, the orange flower here on your left, with a globe mallow bee like sleeping in the flower. So they rely primarily on globe mallow. They can use some other plant species, but they particularly like globe mallow. And then the black bee in the campanula there is a black short face bee. They rely, of course, on harebells and campanula. And these bees need to complete their pollen and nectar collections for their offspring while their special flowers are in bloom, right? Because that's their primary source. And then once this flower is in bloom or is done blooming, those bees are done with their life, right? The bee dies, and hopefully she's provisioned a lot of eggs. So specialist bees are thought to benefit their special plants by increasing the plant seed set. But the flowers here have a variety of bee pollinators, which ensures the plant's reproductive success when the specialist bees are sparse or absent. So the flowers are not exclusive, but the bees are. And then some plants like lupin have these complex flowers that require a bee that can manipulate the flower parts. In this case, lupin don't have nectar, right? So there's not like a immediate reward for the bees, but they have very high quality pollen, but it's hard to get to. So the bee has to, I have some red arrows there because I'm pointing at the bee's leg, but she has landed on the lupin and she pushes that keel petal down with her back legs and exposes the anthers there, the pollen, and collects the pollen. And the bee has to be big enough to manipulate the flower. It also has to be willing to manipulate the flower. So honeybees aren't willing to do this. They can't pollinate lupin, but digger bees like this can pollinate lupin. Bumblebees can pollinate lupin. There are some larger mining bees that can as well. And some bees are they're generalists. This is a wool carder bee. It's using horse mint, Agastache urticifolia. This plant is totally, it's just visited by different pollinators of all kinds, butterflies, moths, bees, wasps, beetles, hummingbirds. It's just like a cacophony of insects. If you come across like sometimes you can find these fields of Agastache that are blooming and it is sometimes buzzing. Like it's just loud with bumblebees. So anyway, this bee, which is a wool carder bee, is also a generalist. And I'd like to point out that this bee is in the family Megacylidae, the leaf cutters and masons. That's its family. And they have pollen collecting hairs on the underside of their abdomen. And so this female is carrying this light pink pollen on her belly. It's really cute. Nettle leaf horse mint, or Agastache urticifolia, or as some people like to say, Agastache. The Latin's a dead language, so you can say whatever you want. So this is all to drive the point home that diverse native plant communities provide for the nutritional needs of a diversity of bees. So here's that knapweed hillside again. So can you think, this is the honeybee PSA, because can you think of a bee species that you see on knapweed? And I'll give you a hint. People love to say that even though knapweed's a weed, it sure makes great honey, right? So honeybees are found very often on knapweed. As it turns out, they're both from Eurasia, but let's talk about them. So honeybees are known as Western or European honeybees. They're not native to the North American continent. And to be clear, they're considered livestock. They're a domesticated animal with worldwide distribution. Commercial beekeepers are regulated by the Department of Agriculture. The species originated in Europe and occurs everywhere that people occur because people like honey. So not only are there no honeybees native to North America, but there are also no bees native to North America that produce honey. So honeybees were first brought to North America by European colonists in the 1600s, and they didn't bring them here because they wanted pollinators. They brought them here because sweeteners were hard to come by in a colonial diet, and beeswax is a really important resource as well. So that's part of the reason why. And the amazing flowering plant diversity we have here in North America makes great forage for honeybees. So they're still, of course, used today. But honeybees are really important in large scale agriculture, but they also have a dark side. I hope the slide never dies. I use this all the time, and I giggle about it every time I use it. It has a dark side for conservation in that honeybees can outcompete native bees at flowers, especially in natural areas where they don't belong and they're not needed. And in fact, bumblebee populations, many of which we know are in decline, they will decline when there are honeybee hives nearby. So they'll forage less, they produce fewer offspring. They're just outcompeted by honeybee hives. Honeybees can have like 100,000 individuals in one box, one big box. A healthy bumblebee colony may have 50 to 250 individuals. So there's just no comparison in the number of individuals. So there's a lot to compete with there. There are places for sure where honeybees are very appropriate, such as this large scale monoculture situation. The orchardists will rent these honeybee hives. The orchard floor in this situation is managed so that there's no plants. It's probably sprayed. So bees can't live here. Native bees can't live here. Nothing is growing here except these almond trees. The honeybees are trucked in. They pollinate the flowers, and then when the flowers are done blooming, the bees are trucked away, and then the farmer will spray whatever they need to spray on the crop there. So yeah, so that honeybees are great in this situation, right? But a lot of people have honeybees because they're worried about pollinators, and rightfully so. And they think that honeybees are a great way to like help the pollinators. But I like to tell people that getting honeybees in order to help the pollinators is like getting chickens to help the birds, because even though chickens are birds, you don't get them for bird conservation, right? You have chickens because you like having fresh eggs, or you just think it's fun to have chickens. But the same with honeybees. I would say honeybees are a little worse because so research is showing that one box of honeybees actually requires about 5 acres of blooming flowers. So if you don't have 5 acres of blooming flowers, your honeybees are using other resources. They're not staying in your yard, right? They're using local resources that wild native bees could be using. And honeybee keeping can be fun, but if you're not serious about it, honeybees are often infected with parasites and diseases such as Nosema virus, and these can pass to wild bees. And they can also pass to commercial bees, and that's no good for commercial beekeepers. So hobby beekeepers have a big responsibility, actually. So this is Packer Meadow at Lolo Pass, and this is a place that Lewis and Clark noted in their journals because it was so remarkable, and it was just buzzing with bees, and there are a lot of native bees, but when I looked closely, there were actually a lot of honeybees, and this is kind of what I see everywhere I go. So once you start seeing them, you really start seeing them, right? So anyway, back to landscaping. You may be thinking, okay, this is great information, but what can I do in my own landscape to make it more pollinator friendly? Since I'm not going to convert my garden to a native plant paradise, it's not going to look like Packer Meadow or anything like that. Well, you can remember that restoration is a process, right? And that whatever you do to make your landscape more pollinator friendly is going to be helpful for pollinators and other insects and birds, for example, that rely on those insects. Remember I showed you a picture of Peter's perfect lawn. A lawn is so American, right? And it's a point of pride for a lot of homeowners, and a lot of people cannot give up their lawn. And that's okay, you guys, it's okay. Especially if a lawn was your ideal when you were growing up, but most people are aware that lawns are pretty wasteful. So a baby step to pollinator-friendly gardening is intentionally diversifying your lawn, right? Maybe there's a reason you want a lawn because you like to hang out with your friends in the backyard and you barbecue. It's a great reason to have a lawn, right? Can you diversify it? There are actually seed mixes designed for this, and we trialed some here in Missoula. We had about 40 volunteers who planted some of the seed mix that was developed at University of Minnesota Extension. We wanted to see if it worked here. It did. It was great. So now Karis Nursery is carrying that blend as of this week. So, and then many of you probably already have a clover lawn. You probably already have clover in your lawn, right? So you're already on your way to having a pollinator friendly lawn. There's just some other things you can do to make your lawn more pollinator friendly. But I also want to point out that flowering lawns are not optimal pollinator habitat, right? They're just a way to make something that you like that's resource intensive, a little less resource intensive and a little friendlier to pollinators. So there's better things you can do. But this flowering lawn mix that we sell and that, well, or that Karis sells is a mixture of fine fescues. So there's nothing native about it except for this self-heal. But otherwise, it's just fine fescues, Dutch white clover, creeping thyme, and self-heal. It's quite lovely. But it is also low growing. It's true lawn. You can walk on it, you can mow it, but it requires less water and no additional fertilizer. And for the love of God, do not spray insecticides or herbicides on anything that you think is going to be pollinator friendly, because that's just rude, right? Why would you do that? So one of the best things you can do, though, is to start removing your lawn, or even little pieces of your lawn, or maybe think of it, instead of removing your lawn, expanding your landscaping, right? And plant more native plants. Not everything has to be native, right? Of course, native is the best, but gardens are for people too. And so plant what you like. Anytime you're incorporating native plants, you're improving the habitat for other creatures, right? So if you are going to include native plants, one thing you could think about are keystone plants and including them in your landscaping. And keystone plants, that's a term championed by Doug Tallamy. If anyone is familiar with his work, he's an ornithologist and ecologist. I don't remember where he's at, but he's on the East Coast. Did someone say, is he in Maryland? Is it Pennsylvania? It's the East Coast. But he's done a lot of work with this, and what keystone plants are? They're native plants that support a large diversity of insects, and in turn can support a lot of they can support birds and other wildlife, right? So yeah, so they can provide that as an ecosystem service. And I did bring a list from the Xerces Society of nice pollinator-friendly plants that you can choose from here in the Rocky Mountain West. So that's a handout in the back. And there's many examples of pollinator-friendly plants here in Missoula. This graph there's just some pictures here of an optimal seed mix developed by Justin Runyon and some of his collaborators out of Bozeman. He works at the Rocky Mountain Research Station. And so these 9 plants provide, if you're in a restoration setting, they provide, along the bottom axis there is time, see May, June, July, August. They bloom throughout the growing season and support a wide diversity of bees. So if you were to just get 9 plants, this would be a really nice selection to choose from. And then on the far side, that is a pine white butterfly, which is my favorite. And that, another keystone plant in this area are ponderosa pines. They support a huge diversity of insects, including pine white butterflies. The pine white butterflies, the eggs are found on the needles of the tree, higher up in the canopy, of course. They eat the needles. The larvae eat the caterpillars, eat the needles. They descend down from the needles on like the silk thread. If you've ever seen a caterpillar hanging, it is very likely a pine white caterpillar. They pupate in the soil at the base of the tree and emerge. And then those are the white butterflies you see around pines. They're the best. They're the best. Anyway, so pines are also a keystone species, keystone plant species. And then, of course, anytime you reduce your use of pesticides or hopefully completely eliminate it if possible, that's always really helpful, right? So remember that one of the main drivers of insect declines and biodiversity loss is pesticide use and overuse. And they can have multiple different effects on pollinators. So some pesticides are lethal. Like insecticides are generally going to be lethal. Not all insecticides are lethal to all insects, but they target insects. So, but what can also be dangerous for insects are sometimes not the herbicide itself, but the additives, or they're called adjuvants, that are included in herbicides, like surfactants that help an herbicide stick to the plant leaf, can get in the hairs of things like a bumblebee and can mat them. And then they can also get in the spiracles. So insects don't have lungs, right? They just have like holes in their body for gas exchange, and they can clog up those spiracles and suffocate them. So, and then neonicotinoids and even fungicides that are applied to the soil can be systemic within the plant tissue. And then the bees are exposed to them when they collect the pollen and nectar. And it might not be lethal to the adult, but it could be lethal to the baby, to the larva that they're providing the pollen and nectar for, right? So so they have some lethal effects, but sometimes it's just sublethal effects, right? So being exposed to different pesticides will make insects sick, even if it's herbicides or fungicides and isn't designed to directly kill them. And what that turns into, that manifests as reduced foraging. So they're out less. That means they're pollinating less. There's reduced egg laying, which means they're not having as many babies. And there's reduced nest building. They don't feel good, right? And when you think about when you're sick and you don't feel good, you don't go to work, you don't want to go to the grocery store, you don't want to do anything, you really don't want to have sex. And so you are not reproducing and you're not being productive. Same with bees. So another way that this manifests is that exposure to pesticides can result in a smaller body size for the offspring. And the reason why this is important is because bee body size is directly correlated with the distance they can travel. So if they can't travel far, then the resources available to them are more limited. And it's a feedback loop, right? If they can't travel far, the resources become smaller, their offspring are smaller, those bees can forage a smaller and so on. But sometimes the combined effects of pesticides and other stressors like poor nutritional quality, some sort of catastrophic event, those can be worse together than either one of them alone. So poor nutrition and fungicide exposure is a real common synergistic problem. So if they can weather poor nutrition, but if they're nutritionally stressed and they encounter something that makes them sick, that can be worse than one of those alone. So there are a lot of ways that you can support pollinators in your own landscape without needing to have it look like this, right? But so remember that restoration is a process, and you're assisting in the recovery of ecosystems and those ecosystem services and other processes, right? And your work in supporting pollinators in your home landscaping will always be a process, and you can tweak it. You don't have to get it right? You can tweak it and manipulate it in ways that suit your needs. You can tear stuff out, you can add more stuff. And it's not going to look like this, and that's okay. That's not your goal. But if your goal is to support pollinators, then you need to keep native plants at the forefront of your mind. So to conclude, I just want to reiterate that pollinators and other insects are vital to ecosystems, and they're declining due to human-caused factors, and that pollinators and plants are tightly linked, and that diverse native plants in our landscaping is a great goal to have. And keep in mind that restoration is a process, and that landscaping for pollinators is a restoration practice, and that you can do in your own landscaping, and you can play a large role in supporting pollinators in urban settings, which are really the newest, they're like kind of the forefront of conservation. So in case you didn't know, Missoula County is an official Bee City USA affiliate. That is a program through the Xerces Society for Conservation, or for Invertebrate Conservation. The Missoula County Commissioners actually signed a resolution last year making Missoula County a Bee City USA affiliate. And currently, is exploring Bee Campus USA certification as well. So if you're interested in that, you can look up www.bcityusa.com or .org, I guess. And it's just kind of a neat, it really just says that the commissioners are, they have prioritized pollinator conservation in the county. And if you didn't know, Missoula County Department of Ecology and Extension is a wealth of resources for you, for gardening information and ecosystem management and pest management and cooking. And so we have the Rocky Mountain Gardens. Molly is here tonight and she could tell you all about it. And you can sign up for newsletters and to volunteer. The plant clinic, if you guys have not accessed that resource yet, is phenomenal. Any horticulture issue you have, you can ask Sandy Perrin, that's her phone number there, about it. We also offer master gardener classes through MSU Extension, and Sarah Holden, our horticulture agent. There's a lot of garden volunteer opportunities. We have Blooms and Brews talks here every month. We also have Cultivate to Cook classes, so stuff that comes from the garden. Our food and nutrition MSU Extension agent will teach you how to cook in our beautiful kitchen upstairs. And then we also offer pest management classes. So this was a screenshot of our Instagram page, just for a little taste of all the good stuff that we offer here. So anyway, with that, I'll conclude my talk, and I hope you guys learned something about bees, and that you're inspired to pay a little more attention to native plants and bees in your life. And I'm happy to answer any questions.